I'm not. That's right. Yeah.
Are you drinking wine too, John?
I am, but right now I'm drinking water.
Okay,
Water. I
so
thought that would be too decadent.
I'm gonna hit broadcast in 3, 2, 1, go.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Frontline Club discussion this evening on the rise, or not, of populism. I'm Elizabeth Palmer. I'm a reporter for CBS News. In a moment, I will introduce our very distinguished guests, but housekeeping notes, we welcome questions and we will try and get to you. If you'd like to ask a question in text, type it into the bar at the bottom of your screen. And if you put your hand up indicating that you'd like to ask it in your own voice, we'll try and come to you during the course of the discussion. I'm very pleased to welcome this evening two distinguished journalists whom I'm proud to call colleagues. John Lee Anderson is joining us from Santiago in Chile this afternoon. He's a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. He's reported from many of the modern conflict zones, and he has also written some magisterial profiles of important political figures, particularly in Latin America, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and one of the great populists of modern times, Hugo Chavez. John, welcome. And Lindsey Hilsum. Lindsey is the international editor at Channel 4 News, but she also is a writer. She contributes to the New Statesman, to the Observer, and countless other extremely prestigious publications. And she also is a very accomplished and extremely courageous field reporter. I've worked with her in the field before, and where she leads, we follow, the rest of us follow. Lindsey, welcome.
Thank you, Liz.
Now, the era of Donald Trump, while not officially over, does seem to be drawing to a close. And that has led some political analysts to maybe wishfully think, or at least project, that this era of populism, of authoritarian nationalism, fascism, even if you might like to call it, is on the wane. And in fact, we are going to turn a corner starting about now. However, the world is being roiled by some pretty huge forces. I can think of, for example, the pandemic first and foremost, but also things like social media and rising income inequality in many countries, including in Western democracies. And so I guess the simple question we can begin with is populism on the wane or on the rise? And I know that both of you have been in the, might call it ground zero of populism recently in Trump's America, the end days of Trump's America. So let me ask you where you were when President-elect Biden won, and what insights that gave you into where we're heading. Lindsey, do you want to start?
Sure. I was in Philadelphia, which is a very Democrat city, but I had been in Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania, which is very pro-Trump. So I had seen both sides in the same state as well as elsewhere. Now, in Philadelphia, there was dancing in the street. There was also, outside the convention center where I was, a collection of Trump supporters, one of whom rather rudely took his trousers down and mooned at the Democrats. And so you can see that this contest isn't over amongst the people. And I think I was looking up what the definition of populism is, and the definition, they vary, of course, but one is it's a leader who comes up with the idea that you have the pure people against the elite. And so the people are the ones who are right and the elite are the ones who are corrupt, what Donald Trump would call the swamp. And I don't think that in America that feeling dies with Donald Trump. It may have lost its leader, or its leader may get less attention, because he will get a lot less attention when he no longer has the bully pulpit of being the president. But those feelings come from somewhere. I suppose we can look at, if we look at the history of where populism is coming from now, it comes after the economic crisis of 2008. just as the fascism of the 1930s came out of the Great Depression. And I suppose my fear now is that with COVID, we're going back down into recession all over the world. So my fear is that those scenes of joy, which I witnessed in Philadelphia, may be short-lived.
John, where were you when Biden won?
Well, I was in touch with Lindsey because I was on a train going between New York and Washington, D.C.
Right.
And we were comparing notes. And while I was on the train, it's about a 3-hour train trip, the news came through that Biden had won. That is to say, you know, it was the definitive electoral victory, which, as we know, has been dragged out until now. But this was about 3 days after the election. And the euphoria that swept the train was extraordinary. It was a COVID empty train, but I could hear a woman 3 seats behind me getting on the phone and weeping with someone she knew. The conductor himself, everybody was being very understated and polite, but this feeling of relief was palpable. And when I arrived in Washington, a friend picked me up and we said, let's go over to the White House, where we already had heard that at what is now called Black Lives Plaza, Lafayette Square, there was celebrations. And 2 things happened, I remember. I saw what Lindsey saw in Philadelphia, which was just euphoria. There were people line dancing, every color under the sun together, the usual kind of people that you also meet at peace and love festivals with every cause going. But it was a real celebration. The closer you got to what used to be the perimeter of the White House and was now fenced in for the first time in my life by Donald Trump, I felt the anger swell in me at the idea that this man could have fenced himself off and fenced off the world from himself. So there was lots of angry messages along that fence, and I absolutely sympathize with them. It was a disgrace and a real desecration of the American democratic spirit, I felt. And so I felt very mixed feelings that day. On the one hand, relief and euphoria, but worry and anxiety of the kind that, Lindsey expressed so well about the future. And particularly as an American who lives abroad, but nonetheless goes back and knows, I feel I know my people, I felt that this wasn't over either. And as the days have gone by, of course, I've felt more and more relief that the institutions and people who of genuine democratic spirit and values have remained in place and are coming to the fore, and I cheer it on. But I worry terribly about this Pandora's box that's been opened, the lowering of tone, the lack of respect, the willingness to violence, first verbally and now, as we've seen, physically in the streets of America. And also what I see a lot of, because I travel in Latin America, as Lindsey also has, is the contagion effect of this language, of this lowering of tone, and the fact that there are kindred regimes that have, and leaders who've now come to the fore and have felt protected by this new, whatever we want to call it, populism, authoritarian nationalism. And some of them are still in place.
So, and how were they watching? When they saw President Trump defeated at the polls, what were the Bolsonaros and the Orbans thinking?
I was watching for Bolsonaro's reaction, and of course, there was none. There was none. Notably or notoriously, he has not yet congratulated Trump. He really hitched his wagon to Trump to the extent of coming up with a slogan, "Make Brazil Great Again." I mean, you can't get more
derivative
of an imitation show than the one going on in Brazil. A number of other leaders have also withheld their congratulations to Biden. Curiously, and perhaps most confusingly, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is the president of Mexico, a leftist nationalist populist, but somehow in his own category, because after all, he's in charge of Mexico, which is the country next door to the United States, and which, of course, Trump used as a whipping dog to get elected in the first place, calling Mexicans rapists and thieves, and erecting his, anti-immigration policy and so forth. He clearly is Bambi in the headlights and doesn't know quite what to do. And I was just in Mexico.
John Lee, there's something which I haven't understood, because when we talk about populism at the moment, on the whole, we're talking about right-wing populism, Bolsonaro, right, Trump, etc. But AMLO, like Chavez, is left-wing populism. And I find it really hard to understand him. I find it very hard to understand why he's fitting in with Trump in that way, when I would have thought, having been in Mexico many years ago and not recently, that his support base would not respond to that.
Yeah, and if anything, he has done everything Trump has asked him since he became president years ago. I know him, and we spoke during his campaign, and he privately expressed, he did the Betty Boop wide eyes whenever names came up. He wouldn't be quoted about him. And he told me he would be cautious with Trump, whom he regarded clearly as a kind of, a real American monster, the ultimate ugly American. But nonetheless, since he became president, he's temporized with Trump. He has allowed Mexico to become the place where Central American refugees are held back. He's signed a trade deal with Trump. He even came to Washington and ingratiated himself with Trump. And now he's withheld acknowledgement of Biden's victory to Joe Biden. I was just in Mexico before coming here to Chile, where I am, and I talked to a number of people there, and they suggest that AMLO, as he's called, isn't so different than Trump. Now, I'm not entirely convinced of that, but in the sense that he is someone who wants to control the news of the day. He holds a 2-hour press conference every day at 7 a.m. And so in that sense, he's a populist, as Chavez was, as you rightly pointed out, as Trump was with Twitter in his own gringo way. The idea that you control the news of the day and everybody has to respond to you, and you create a direct contact with the people. So in that sense, he inhabits the same space. Politically, he's not on the same page, but to the extent that Trump, as we know, cared one iota about human rights or pretty much anything except his own ratings and the promises he made to his base before becoming president, whether it was building the wall or keeping migrants out, as long as AMLO, fed the beast, so to speak, he didn't, he wasn't going to criticize him. In fact, he lowered the tone. And so I think that there was an element of kind of entente cordiale. You do what I want and I'll leave you alone. And that's pretty much what it's been. I think things are going to change now with Biden. Again, I think populism on the left is, it's something different than populism on the right, which does border on fascism, as Trump's, leanings were clearly in that way. The left, nonetheless, there is a meeting ground, of course, ultimately, when you try to appeal to the people. But the peculiarities of Mexico's politics have everything to do with the fact that it is a nation that borders the United States. And it's a nation that's been historically humiliated by the United States, conquered. It had half of its territory taken by the United States 150 years ago, and now provides the black labor, so to speak, for the United States. So it has its own pathology, I think. Anyway, I don't know. Back to you, Elizabeth.
I'm interested to know what conditions are propitious for populists themselves, and also for populations who may want populist leadership, and how many of those conditions are in place today in large parts of the world. Lindsey, do you want to take a run at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I said earlier, I think that the economic crash of 2008, I think that people who had reasonably comfortable lives, including myself, with a job, a salary, underestimated the impact of that in Europe and elsewhere. I mean, vast numbers of people lost their jobs, lost their livelihoods. You know, in America, foreclosures, people who lost their homes. You know, this was a desperate situation, and I think that that is one of the key things, which is why I am concerned about the time ahead. I mean, look at this country when we're talking about, you know, an 11 point something % drop in GDP this year. These are the conditions in which populism grows, because people are angry and frightened, and, you know, and they've lost a lot of the meaning of their lives and the rhythm of their lives. And then obviously you have the issue about blaming the other. So I think that when I really became, you know, aware of it, or more aware of it as a story, was in 2015, because I was following the refugees coming across into Europe, and I spent a bit of time in Hungary, and I walked with refugees through Hungary and so on. And that was when Viktor Orban was building the fence. And I remember, oh God, I can remember being refugees who were cutting through the fence and then being on the other side and, you know, going under the fence. And so I can still go under a fence, by the way, you know, I'm not that old. And so, you know, there was all of this going on, and this blaming of the refugees for the problems which the people of Hungary had. And that, of course, is exactly the same as Donald Trump was doing at the same time, you know, or a little while later in 2016. You know, in Austria and all of these different places in Europe, this blaming of outsiders. And arguably, you can see Brexit as part of the same.
But are you saying that though that great wave of refugees were particularly resented because the countries they were walking through were filled with people who were still hurting from the financial crisis, who felt, you know, economically insecure and afraid that they were going to lose the little they had to strangers? You know, the way, John, I'll let you add something, but I'm interested to know from both of you how you think social media plays into these kinds of fears, and also how social media is a factor in Brazil. I'd like to get back to Brazil, but take it away, John.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, while Lindsey was talking about it, I remember that summer so well. And I'll never forget how everything turned on the photograph of the little boy, Alan Kurdi, lying face down dead on a beach in Greece, a Syrian refugee. And Merkel opened up her borders. So one thing I think, you know, is instructive to learn from that to the authoritarians, to the populists, to the people who would manipulate the media in order to gain power, they could see, quite apart from the rightness or wrongness of opening Europe's borders unilaterally, as Chancellor Merkel did, out of a humanitarian gesture, and because of Germany's own unique pathologies with history, whether it was right or wrong or not, or politically sound, it would have sent a message to the Erdogans, the Putins, and all of the others of this world in the following way. So all it takes is a photograph. All it takes is a photograph, and you can do whatever you want. These 27 nations are putty in our hands. And I mean, fast forward 4 years or 5 years, and I think you'll see that there's a lot of, there's much evidence that in the years since then, the people that were learning already or studying social media, television, the use of the new, you know, WhatsApps, Twitters, whatever, to sell products, now we're able to see the ways in which they could mestatize their messaging. We saw it with ISIS and their horrific videos. There was a number of things happening from about 2013, 14, 15 that had a kind of a tectonic effect, whether it was the images of those, you know, young men surging through Europe, or the horrific beheadings, which somehow in a lot of people's minds were associated. And there was an outbreak of terror in Europe. We then saw Brexit happen. And, you know, just to go back to the economic factor, there's no doubt that, you know, Thatcher broke the unions in Britain. Tony Blair essentially sold out the socialist part of the Labour Party. And and with alongside Clinton in the United States, there was this kind of neoliberal era in which a kind of humanistic, under the Democrats and Labor, this kind of humanistic stewardship of the market forces, which were supposed to somehow propel us forward into the future following the collapse of the USSR and the Cold War. And what we ended up with was a very uneven landscape in which in the northern parts of Britain, traditionally Labor, and in the Rust Belt of the United States, traditionally Democrat, these people were essentially abandoned by their old party stewards. There were no party stewards anymore. Manufacturing did travel to China. In that sense, Trump has an evil genius in perceiving certain truths that were being avoided out of politeness or
but it also because the center left, abandoned the idea of equality. And so you had this growing inequality, which I think is also a major source. But I think that to build on what you're saying about social media, I mean, obviously you had Cambridge Analytica and all this manipulation, but one of the things that really struck me traveling around America for this election was how these conspiracy theories, which are spread on social media, how they've taken root. So, for example, I was in Arizona, in Tombstone, Arizona, at the annual Eldorado Festival, which I have to say is the best fun anybody has ever had. I mean, it's lots of horses dressed as unicorns and people in crazy costumes. It's marvelous. But it's a very, it turned into a Trump fest. The people there were very pro-Trump. And so we were filming it, and then I was just randomly going up to people in the way that television journalists do and asking their opinion. And I came across a lady, and she must have been, I guess, in her 70s, and she's voting Trump. And I said, why? And she said, because otherwise they're going to put us in concentration camps. And so I said in my best Princess Diana voice, do you really think, madam, that Joe Biden is going to put you in a concentration camp? And she said, yes, just like they do in China. And then I kind of teased it out. And what I understood in the end was somewhere she had heard about the Uyghurs in China being put in concentration camps, which is true. And she had also heard that Joe Biden was a front for communist China. And she had put the two things together. Ergo, Joe Biden is going to put us all in concentration camps because he is communist China incarnate in America. Now, that was a particularly crazy example of it, but particularly in Miami, amongst the Cuban Americans, the Biden es socialista, not just Biden es socialista, Biden is pedófilo. Biden is a pedophile. And I interviewed one of the main YouTubers, Cuban American YouTubers, Alejandro Otaola, who's kind of spreading this stuff, well, I can't say he's a pedophile, but, the way he moves, it's a little strange. The way he touches women and children, have you noticed? You could see all of this. And this stuff, I think it's very embedded, and it's not just young people. This is amongst nearly everybody I met who was a major conspiracy theorist were in their 50s, 60s, and 70s.
I think you're absolutely right, Lindsey. Sorry, I was just going to say, Liz, and to bring it back to Brazil as you asked, but what's interesting about all of these populists, I was saying earlier that they try to control the messaging, and mostly they do it through one or another social media, whether it's WhatsApp or Facebook or Twitter. And interestingly, in all of the places where we're seeing this new authoritarianism, this includes Trump and Pizzagate and QAnon and these bizarre extreme tranches of his base that used to be way out on the fringes and are now somehow part of the Republican Party. Orban's Hungary, Bolsonaro's Brazil. We have this. There's this sexual trigger. In fact, in Colombia, the current president is not himself a populist, but he's sort of controlled by a former president who's on the extreme right. And in each case, in some cases, very frontally, they accuse in elections, they accuse their adversaries of being pedophiles.
This is so weird, isn't it?
And they simply bombarded and this comes out of the culture of the last decade of, first it was civil unions, and then it was gay marriage, and then it's transsexual bathrooms. And in the United States, it's this culture of changing the semantics for identity politics, which really gets the conservative movement, and I guess reaches its tentacles far into the deepest recesses of ignorance and reaction. But nonetheless, there's something in common, and it seems to be the most effective trigger in political campaigns in each case to win a referendum or win an election. Just going back to my own moment, you were in Hungary in 2015 when you became aware of this. I was in Colombia, and it was a few weeks after Brexit, and there was I had been following the Colombian peace deal between the government and the Marxist FARC guerrilla movement of the previous, that had been fighting for the previous 50 years. And this former president, who is somehow the puppet master today,
Uribe,
to hold protests against his successor, and along with members of the Catholic Church, because the education minister was a transsexual. And the day before the national referendum, they held a series of marches in which they played on this and said that part of the deal with the FARC by the government was to preach homosexuality in schools. And the referendum lost. A slight majority, very similar numbers as in Britain with Brexit, voted against the peace deal. And the president had to spend the next 2 months juggling, and he had to get rid of the socially progressive clauses in the peace deal in order to push it through. He had enough power to push it through, but he literally had polarized the country, and to this day, 4 years later, then a conservative followed him, and they've done everything they can to undermine that peace deal. Back to the night of this no winning in Colombia. The next morning, I, like a lot of people, was in a state of shock. And so a Colombian friend walked up to me and they said, "John Lee, you realize what this means, don't you? First there was Brexit. Now the no vote in Colombia. This means Trump is going to win." This was, of course, 3 months before the election.
Yeah.
And he did. And, so the Bolsonaro, a few months later, won in Brazil with the very same message. It turns out that in Brazil, everyone uses WhatsApp. And most Brazilians, even if they're, working class, have what they call these packages, where you pay a certain amount. And even if you can't pay your bill that much and they kind of, you don't get your phone hours, they still can send you messages, ads. And one of Bolsonaro's sons is a kind of cyber wizard. He's still with him. He does all of his messaging. They did the entire campaign off Facebook Live, kind of, 3 guys and a horse kind of thing, in a living room and a laptop. And then a few days before the election, they bombarded millions of people with WhatsApp messages calling his liberal, progressive rival a pedophile. And he won.
This is so interesting. I must do a story on this. I didn't know there were all these connections everywhere.
Yeah. And there's similar investigations in Brazil into that whole business, is in the same way as with Caroline Cadwallader in Britain with Cambridge Analytica. Very, very analogous. So people seem to be swapping information in these places. Yeah.
Well, I'm intrigued with the notion that populism or authoritarian nationalism provides easy answers, and they may not be true, but they're easily digestible and repeatable. And how much of the turn towards authoritarianism or populism is a reaction to the cacophony of information out there? And I'm just going to read you, it's not a question, but a quote. Taos Harrison, who wrote, quoting you, John, all it needed was a photo, perhaps it was Lindsey, on BBC Radio 4 today in a piece about climate change. The comment was that people don't respond to data and science, possibly because it's so damn complicated and contradictory, but they do to emotional appeals, to hearts and minds. I mean, what's going on there? How big a factor is the "I don't get it, it's too complicated" in the world of too much information?
I think that that's clearly a factor. But there is now a counter factor, and that is COVID-19. And so you've got all of that, and these people, it's all, I mean, we all feel it, we all want to hide under the duvet sometimes, don't we? Because there's just too much information. Sometimes I sit in my room quivering about, should I be looking at Ethiopia, or should I be looking at, Brazil, or should I be looking at, it's just too much. And everybody feels that it's too much. And then we have a way of dealing with that, is that we have, well, I have a way of dealing with that. I just call John Lee. But, we have a way. What matters, John Lee? Tell me. But we have a way, don't we? Because we know which news sources we trust and which ones we don't, and what we're looking for. And so we can put order in the chaos according to our way of looking at things, which is not the only way, and not necessarily the best way, and not necessarily the right way, but it is a way. And I think it is much more difficult. But now you have this thing, COVID-19, which doesn't care about the information out there. And of course, I know that there are anti-vaxxers, and I know that there are conspiracy theories around it. But these populists came to power with simple solutions, and they came to power through their campaigning, and they cannot govern. And they cannot control this thing, and they cannot get on top of it, because WhatsApp and all of these things and blaming pedophiles does not sort out COVID-19. So this is the interesting question.
But it might buy them time. Like you can get away with a lot if you just keep blaming.
Totally. But, Trump was voted out, and, there's all sorts of analyses of why. But one of the main ones is because people were dying, because he did not have a policy that worked on COVID-19. Now, Brazil, Bolsonaro has been appalling on COVID-19. The number, I was there earlier in the year at the height of it, it's terrible. Will that make people move against him? I don't know. John Lee, what do you think?
It's very troubling, Lindsey, but absolutely, as you say, I mean, he was very an analogous behavior to Trump's with COVID. And yet, and as I say, I'm headed there. I'm trying to make sense out of the latest in Brazil. But what I'm hearing is that his polling has actually gone up. Now,
oh, no, really?
How is that possible? It's very difficult. I mean, in one of his latest interventions, and this is about the 10th time, he said something deeply wounding and cutting to his own people, and heartlessly since COVID. He began by walking around saying, we all have to die sometime, and so what, and that kind of thing. It's all televised. Just about a week ago, he came out and he repeated this sentiment, and he said, we all have to die. Let's stop being a bunch of sissies. He actually used a worse word, a homophobic word. People are in shock in the same way that they were with Trump's expletives and, outrageous comments. So why does this man and his, crude behavior appeal to people? There's clearly some pathology going on in Brazil that would explain it. Now, I hope to be able to answer that a little better. Maybe you can come back.
Good, I'm waiting for that.
Yeah, what do you think, Lindsey, though? You've been there.
I don't know. I don't know if people saw that there was this extraordinary thing on Twitter last week from this nurse in South Dakota. So South Dakota is one of the worst places for COVID-19 at the moment. And this poor nurse, she had a weekend off, and she's just run ragged with people dying. She said the most difficult thing to deal with is the people who are dying who don't believe that COVID-19 exists. And they say to me, I know I'm dying, but it's not COVID-19, is it? And I say, yes, it is COVID-19. And they say, no, but that's fake. That's not true. I don't believe it. And so this poor woman and her colleagues have this, they have to deal with this.
But why would it be so important to people to deny something like COVID-19? I mean, what's that all about? And its relationship to a leader that tells them simple lies?
I can't answer that question, Liz.
Well, I have an idea. It just came up while we were speaking. Actually, it was when you were talking earlier, Lindsey. And I went back to the Cold War, and I was thinking about what you were saying about Americans and this kind of very callow, innocent, or ignorant response to science, and being unable to well, actually, it was in your question, Liz. This people. Is it possible that it's because people are unable to absorb scientific information, or maybe things that they don't see? But I think when you're talking about countries like the United States, and for that matter, the same would be true of Brazil. I think you're talking about people who have been very conditioned by the Cold War. Remember that went on for a long time. And speaking for Americans, but also pretty much through Latin America, it was very reductionist. The anti-communist message, however much virtue there was in opposing communism, the actual way it was unveiled and channeled to the populations in Latin America, and for that matter, the United States, was brutish and crude and sometimes murderous. So you had several generations of people that were told that anything related to communism, in fact, the word socialism in the United States, the very people that would benefit from socialized medicine running for their guns. They've been conditioned to think that this is the invasion of the body snatchers. And so sadly, you have a large number of people who are uninformed, undereducated, very possibly underemployed or unemployed, and who nonetheless, and who have several shibboleths and sacred cows. One of them is this idea that, over there represent, the weak-kneed, portal to totalitarian and communism, the wolves just beyond the kraal or the campsite. And, it was equally, there's actually many analogies that can be made between Brazil and the United States. Both were slaver countries. Brazil actually imported 4 times the number of African slaves from the African continent, the United States. It was the last country in the world to ban slavery, that is to say in the West. We know that our Saudi friends continued to this day with slavery, and I think only banned it a couple of decades ago. But nonetheless, in the Americas, the Brazilians didn't do it until practically the turn of the century. And so they have many of the same issues of inequality, poverty, and violence that the United States does, as well as denial of the past and a sense of themselves as a settler country. This is the new world. And typically our presidents and our political campaigns have been very reductionist. Everything's boiled down to sound bites or pull quotes or slogans, and people have been conditioned to follow them. And sadly, amongst the more gormless, the more ignorant, frankly, they're easily led by slogans that appeal to, I think, the lowest common denominator and their basest instincts, whether it's fear or hope, hope of enfranchisement.
Two sides of the same coin, aren't they?
But I think the one thing we're missing out in this analysis is the utter failure of the centre left. Because let us not, suggest that there are, these glorious people who are providing an alternative which will appeal to people and which will, which actually understands what their needs are. Because that, I think, is the Blair Clinton thing. And this, Peter Mandelson, I'm completely relaxed about people getting, as rich as they want and so on. There was that was a time of, in this country, a time of prosperity. And when prosperity was spread, it was a good time in some ways. But this rising inequality and this, what many people in Britain, I think, saw as class betrayal, that had consequences, which I think that certainly journalists failed to understand and failed to see. Certainly metropolitan journalists like myself. And I think that that's true in America as well. So then you have this whole thing when Trump comes into power and everybody reads the same book, Hillbilly Elegy, and then goes out into Appalachia, as if they're on some safari, to find these strange creatures, the Trump supporters, and earnestly interviews them. But what is your life like? I mean, it was like sort of David Frost, it was absolutely extraordinary, as if nobody had met these people before. Who are these people? It was, it was horrific. And that is a real thing. It's a failure of elites. I hate to use that word. It's a failure of us who are part of that. It's a failure of providing any kind of meaningful alternative. And that's also a vacuum in which populism rises.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm
Wigan
gonna go.
Pier.
Go ahead, John. Do you want to?
No, I was just thinking, when was it that Orwell wrote his book about Wigan Pier?
Yeah.
Which was an instructive book about the working class at a certain time in Britain. And you're right. I think there are these waves of perception, I guess, in which we come and go from our awareness of the underclass, the working class, those who become a kind of white noise, and just as they have in the past in revolutions, this time, they're being swept up by, in the past, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, now they're being swept up by, these dunderheads like Bolsonaro or Trump or Orban, quite manipulative, clever person. We're in a post-ideological era. These are people who really have no known moral compass or ideological or philosophical standard, I should say. But they know how to use the technology we have today and their perception of fears and weaknesses and deficiencies to exploit people's sentiments and to get them on board. It's a very volatile and dangerous time.
I'm going to turn to a question from Rana Swayze now, who starts out by saying to you, John, you wrote The Fall of Baghdad, which is one of my favorite books I've ever read on the region. I'm a big fan of your work. How do you see Iraq now in the lens of populism? And how is social media a factor in Iraq? And I guess we can extend that to the Middle East. Both of you have extensive experience there. Do you want to take a run at that?
I'm going to defer more to Lindsey because she was there most recently and has actually been amongst those kids who were part of that protest movement recently in Baghdad. And I have not been back to Iraq for some time, but just to speak to the Iraq and the Iraqis I know generally, I mean, here you have a country, in a sense, and a society that's, in a sense, it's a kind of historical putty. And what do I mean by that? Or clay. Whoever gets it can try to mold it. This is a country that's had an incredibly brutal, bloody birth in the modern era. For the past 100 years, Iraq has barely known any peace. And there is, in societies where there is religious faith, and Iraq has a religious faith, it's still a faith-based society to a large extent. There is always the search for the savior, whether it's someone who comes out of the religion or in repudiation of the religion, as was Saddam, like a lot of other men of his generation, the kind of, the Baathists, the secular, the great Arab nation builders who used Stalin-style brutality to impose their will, but also to modernize their countries and to create generations of Iraqis and in other countries who would respond to a firm hand because, they stopped the tribes from warring. They built the trains. They built the modern city. We've seen that was a real syndrome of the 20th century. And we saw, several generations of people who were so terrorized and atomized that they acquiesced. And what we're seeing in their wake, in the disappearance of these sort of demigod strongmen, is a reassertion of faith-based societies, and also of clever men and women, in some cases better than others, who understand the pathologies that their countries suffer from and can exploit them, just as we've seen with Trump and Bolsonaro with these
think
social media.
I think that there's a different dynamic. I mean, I was there in January, so that's a while back. But what really struck me, going there in January, having not been there for a couple of years, but, like John Lee, having been there through the war and so on, was this massive generational divide. Now, I have a feeling that the question may be Iraqi and may know much more about this than either John Lee or I. But what really struck me was this new generation who I was meeting on the streets in the protests. I mean, more than anything else, the extraordinary hairstyles of the young men. They were absolutely fabulous. I went around taking photographs of guys with these fantastic quiffs and all of these things, because they were in connection with the outside world and were developing this in a way that their parents could not understand at all. And so what it seemed to me was you had this sclerotic government very much in the hands of the Iranians, and for whom this argument between, who controls Iraq, is it the Iranians or is it the Americans or is it the Saudis, was the central thing. And for these young people, the central issue was entirely different. The central issue was about how are we going to live as ourselves in the meaning of our own individual lives, which was something that you would never have found in Saddam's time, or because people didn't have a concept of their individual lives in the same way. And so to me, it wasn't about populism and so on, although it was much more about that generational divide. And I have no idea how they're going to deal with that, because the government instinct is just to crack down and to kill people.
Yeah.
Similar thing is happening in Cuba right now, by the way. But anyway, I'm sure. There's
Really?
it's just beginning.
So we're going to switch to Germany now on a question from Frank Erich, who says, "What's your opinion about the populist AfD party and its activities in Germany, and does it pose a real threat to German democracy?" Either of you spent any time in Germany recently?
A little earlier this year, but I wouldn't regard myself in any way as someone who truly understands or knows or is familiar with German politics. But I read a bit about them, and I see in the sense that they, inhabit a really uncomfortable proximity to the extreme right, given Germany's past, and particularly what used to be East Germany's unreconciled relationship with its demons. I think it's extremely worrisome, and I do regard it as a worrisome phenomenon.
You don't think
that's about all I can say?
Yeah, I was just impressed at the time when Angela Merkel opened the doors to refugees, that German institutions by and large held. I mean, she paid a terrible political price, but that seemed to be the kind of test of German democracy and order that perhaps Trump's presidency was of the United States. It's almost as if it's already passed a really acid test in a very reassuring way. We've got 10 minutes left, and so I want to come back to the question we began with, and that is, are we going to see populism continue to rise? And if so, where is it going to be most powerful and seductive? John, what are your thoughts on that?
My feeling is that we now all have a chance to see some action taken from Washington to help pull some levers domestically and abroad to bring it back from the brink. And I think we're seeing that with the statements of intent, the kind of team that Biden has put together, the idea that America is back. It's still a morally sound country. It's going to have they're going to have a lot of work to do, but nonetheless, it is still a powerful nation. Everybody is aware of the rise of China. I don't think anybody has any illusions about the Chinese Communist Party's, humanitarian impulses. Nor does anybody have any illusions anymore about Russia. If once upon a time Russia represented some kind of notional communist ideal, we've now had 30 years of a gangster state, and so there is a chance now for the Biden-Harris administration to revive the multilateral institutions, hopefully reform them where they're needed, where they were ships sinking in the water, like the UN, NATO, the EU, so many other institutions that can be props for that, foundering ship. And I'm sure there's many more I haven't thought of or mentioned. But I do think that, the Trump effect is global, and I think it's out there, and part of it has to do with something you mentioned at the very beginning, Liz, and that's social media. What are we going to do about that? What do we do about the Zuckerbergs and Facebooks and the way we now realize we're all manipulated and molded by these forces that are in these little magic temples in our hands that can wreak havoc as well. I was just in Africa not too long ago, and it's not on our news headlines, but the president of Tanzania, who was just reelected, it's not a neuralgic state, so it's off center. But Magufuli, he was reelected. He seems to have stolen the election. He dealt with COVID by saying that we can beat it by praying. It's classic populism. Africa, with many of these countries, have tribal traditions. They've had superimposed on them kind of Cold War strongmen, and now they're some are stumbling towards a democratic future, but many still have these kind of big men in charge of them. Museveni in Uganda has been in for something like 34 years. These places are prime targets for manipulation through populist messaging. And throughout Latin America, we're going to continue to see it because we still have Bolsonaro. There's a couple in Central America. So it's it's something that we're going to have to confront. And I think we need maybe some Marshall plans here and there. And I'm not talking about necessarily just a US one, but what do you do with whole regions that are now full of failed states? What is Central America and the Caribbean basin, if not an area that's just full of failed states? On the one hand, having succumbed to the narcotic consumer industry of the United States, and on the other hand, being the recipients of the weapons that are sold freely in the United States, which kill people back in their countries. We've done very little in terms of real investment in those countries to build their own economies so that their people don't travel north and become migrants in the United States. We have a toxic synergy that the US in particular has a huge moral responsibility for, and I believe an economic one as well. If we're going to right the ship and avert new dictatorships, new despotic, regimes, and for that matter, Trump-like populisms, we're going to have to invest in certain parts of the world more than others, and really, really, really do it, for the first time in a long time.
I said earlier before we went live that I had been in Iran during the American election, and a lot of Iranians were puzzled because this thing was taking so damn long, and there were all these sort of procedures and recounts, and they said, look, if President Trump wanted to win, why hasn't he just won already? In other words, why hasn't he sort of rigged it, basically? And it occurred to me then that the lesson of the American election, to some extent, is that even powerful, committed populists can be undone by strong institutions. And so the lesson of the American election to other populists is we better gut the institutions really fast because they're going to be the end of us. In other words, there's a dangerous message coming out of the American election, or at least it's going to give them some ideas. Now that was just my own interjection. But Lindsey, do you want to take a look at run at whether or not populism is on the wane or on the rise?
I mean, I agree with John Lee that the demise of Trump is very important, and I think that it will take a dip because of that. But the area of the world I guess I'm concerned about is Eastern Europe, because you look at who congratulated Trump on winning, the leader of Slovenia, and then you have and then there were senior people in Estonia also, and so and some of these places have been, their economies have been hit by COVID, although they haven't done as badly as Western Europe has done, interestingly enough. And so that is my worry, is really, I think both Eastern and Western Europe is areas which have been, where the economies are going to be in the doldrums, maybe for 3-4 years. And also places where there is a history of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is another issue which frequently arises in populism because it is the classic historic,
That's
otherization.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
how you can other Mexicans or whatever. But in Europe, it's normally the Jews, isn't it? And so, those, so Europe, I think, worries me a lot because it's less influenced by America than Latin America is. It has more of its own dynamics. And we're still, and obviously you're seeing in Poland, the assault on women's rights and abortion. Orban is very popular. Orban is doing very well. He has gutted the institutions. Poland is attacking the institutions. The European Union is completely failing to deal with that amongst its own members. It's completely, Poland and Hungary are able to veto things that the European Union wants to do. And so I look at those parts of, I look at Europe with great concern, but I don't want to end on a totally negative note, because I do think that the other thing is that populists have been exposed by their failure to deal with the pandemic. Yeah. And I do think that in America, 5 million more people voted for Joe Biden, who is a centrist. He, now, and we don't have time to discuss this, the left in America, Bernie Sanders. Is Bernie Sanders a populist? That's a topic for another day. But one of the things I did was I tried to talk to people who had voted for Trump in 2016 and were going to vote for Biden this time. And I came across a lovely woman in suburban Pennsylvania. And interestingly, she was somebody who worked for a funeral service. And so she had a lot of people on the phone thinking they were going to die of COVID or watching their family members dying. She had seen a lot of serious stuff. And she said, I can't, why? She said, I'm embarrassed that I voted for Trump last time. I voted for a celebrity. I loved his show. Nobody could dissuade me. That was why I went for it. And I said, well, you loved him for those reasons. Isn't Biden a bit boring? And she said, oh, we could do with boring now. And I do think that there is a sense of that in America and maybe in other places. Oh, Lord, make politics boring. And that is a very anti-populist thought.
Yeah, the comics are going to miss Trump, aren't they?
Oh, yes. And so will be journalists who go running after every bloody tweet and so on. I mean, part of it's our fault.
Oh, well, yeah, that was the challenge of the age. I know my Washington colleagues had to every day do a triage. How many of this barrage of tweets are worthy of any kind of consideration?
Who created Nigel Farage? The media created Nigel Farage.
Yeah.
How often was Nigel Farage on television? All the time. Why was he always on the television? Why was Jacob Rees-Mogg always on television? Because they're available. Because you get to an hour before
they're good TV.
And, they're always there. And they'll give you a very good soundbite, and they're always there.
So we have to dance off the stage fairly quickly now, but you have brought us back to one last question, which is a good one, and let's keep our answers short. If you keep your answers short, if you would, and that is, what are the responsibility of journalists, and what can journalists do to counter populism in the next chapter? That's from Caroline to Bertodano, and thank you very much for an excellent question, which honestly I'd love to hear your thoughts, because it preys on me as a journalist, and I'm not sure how best to direct my efforts. John, what would you say?
I find myself telling young journalists in Latin America, I speak, and pretty much everywhere, that I'm using the word militant. It may not be the right word, but I say we must be militant. We must be activists in defense of our profession and therefore of democracy. If nothing else we've learned from Donald Trump, it's that he regards us, in fact, all authoritarians regard us as the enemy. And without trying to exalt our individual condition as journalists, there's no doubt that we are a kind of public servant. And the best of us try to do our sincere best to relay what we believe to be the reality. We don't do fake news. We aren't perfect. We're not objective, but we do try to be sincere. And as long as we can maintain a constituency, as long as people out there, a majority of people out there, believe in us and believe in our sincerity, we have a place in this world, and we are the last line of defense for democracy. If it weren't that case, why would Trump have tried to steal the messaging from us every single day? And why did he attack us to our faces and by name and call us enemy of the people every day? One thing I learned was that he was my enemy. In fact, any leader, any official who tells a journalist that they're his enemy or her enemy, in fact, is a mortal foe and must be fought as one. Now, I think we can do so through our profession. It means we have to pull out all the stops. We have to really think about and get neurotic about how much airtime we're giving those people. And when necessary, we need to turn them off. And if possible, we need to find ways to fight them. I don't think that we can sit on our hands anymore. Climate change is coming. We don't have a lot of time. We've got to win this battle. That's what I would say.
Yeah, climate
But
change
I
is like
also
COVID.
think- But I also think that, I mean, without sounding like a populist myself by talking about the people, we treat the people with respect. And one of the things that I've learned in reporting America is that it is my job to interview people who voted for Trump and who plan to vote for Trump with respect, and to listen to them, and to not treat them with derision, and to not treat them as if I am better than them and I know better. My job is to understand this phenomenon. And if I can't communicate with those people and those people can't communicate with me and I can't convey that, then there is no hope at all. Because then all you are doing is being, those annoying people, of which we are seeing a lot of, preaching to the converted and telling us, what words that we as journalists can use, Latin X. I don't know I haven't met anybody in, America who is Latino, Latina, Hispanic, Cuban American, Venezuelan American. People describe themselves in many different ways, but on the whole, not Latin X, which is coming from somewhere else. A lot of Latinos and Black people voted for Trump. It's our job to understand why. It is our job, I agree with John Lee, it's our job to call out lies, and it's our job to not be manipulated, but it is also our job to understand and to not blame people. Blame leaders, but don't blame people.
Well, a call to arms. Thank you very much to both of you. It's been such a pleasure to hear your thoughts and to see you. Let me wish you a happy American Thanksgiving, and to any Americans who've tuned in, a happy Thanksgiving to you, and many thanks. It's been so interesting.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.